If you struggle with working out why you do each type of run and how to structure your training week, this video will be really good for you because I'll talk you through all of this so they can train really efficiently and reduce the risk of injury as well in the process. So the first thing we're going to talk about is lifestyle. A pro runner would have a very different lifestyle to someone working 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. And that would be different to someone that's a student or someone that owns a business and has different working hours compared to the typical 9 to 5 job. So there's all this that we need to take into account, and that's why it's important to remember that everyone's so different. You need to realize and understand what is best for you, and that's why I can't really give some really specific advice because it really depends on the person. And that's what my coaching service is for as well. We look into what your lifestyle is, and then we look at your sporting background, which we'll talk about more in a second, and then we kind of get a better idea of how to structure a week around the lifestyle to make it work best for you. Because different sorts of lifestyles add different sort of stresses, because if you do a lot of night shifts, if you're a doctor or work in healthcare, you're probably not going to get optimum sleep, and we have to really think about how to make sure our recovery is dialed in, but you're still getting in the training for your marathon or whatever you're training for. So lifestyle is a huge factor that you need to consider. When is the most optimal time for you to run? And that's going to differ from person to person. Another thing I want to talk about is frequency of runs, and that is how many times a week you're running, basically. And this will vary from person to person depending on your lifestyle as well. But at the end of the day, if you're only running 2 or 3 times a week, you're probably going to hit this plateau pretty soon in your running journey, just because you can only increase the distance of your runs so much before needing another run to kind of even it out a bit more. You don't really want to do 3 20K runs in a week. You want to be able to spread out the mileage across more runs in a week. That's usually the better way to do it, especially if you're getting into running. And even if you're only a year or 2 into your running journey, you probably don't want to do 3 20K runs in a week. You want to spread it out across more days. And that's why we're going to talk more about how to structure those extra runs in a week a bit better. Because with 3 runs a week, it's really hard to tackle every single type of run that you really want to hit in order to get specific training for specific events. So if you're starting off, maybe that's fine. 3 runs a week, that's totally cool. Doing 3 easy runs just to get familiar with what it's like to run 3 times a week and then increasing it later on. I think that's totally fine. So my key takeaway for running frequency is that before we increase our long runs or whatever, we want to make sure we run more times a week, and then we can focus on increasing the distance of each run. So at the start, I don't mind how far you're running. It can be really short. Just try and increase the amount of times a week you're running. Try and work towards running every other day or almost every day, but then some days you have a rest in between. So yeah, getting towards 4 or 5 runs a week, that's really beneficial, especially if you're training for a marathon, just because it takes a lot of training to be able to work towards a marathon. I've made a whole video on how I think people rush to the marathon way too quick. I might sound controversial by saying, you know, if you only run 3 times a week, don't even bother running the marathon yet. But it is actually the case. I feel like social media really makes it seem like everyone has to run a marathon to be a runner. But in my opinion, I think the beauty of running is it's a spectrum. Everyone's on their own journey. You don't have to rush to a marathon. You're still a runner if you haven't run a marathon yet. And if you're only running 3 times a week, I don't think you are going to get enough prep to complete a marathon or run a marathon in the time that you want. I think there's nothing wrong with putting yourself through a challenge, just doing a marathon for the sake of it, but I feel like you should never do a marathon because of external motivation. And by that, I mean doing a marathon because other people are doing it and not actually wanting to do it yourself. So make sure you always think about why you're doing a marathon before you just get into doing a marathon, is the main point. Anyway, that's a tangent. Let's move on to sporting background. So sporting background is really important to consider as well, because some people have come from doing no sports when they were young and, you know, doing stuff like football, basketball, and, you know, track and field, whatever. When you're younger, you're going to have a lot of experience running really quick on the track or on the field a lot, and that's going to play into, you know, your fiber type composition and a lot of different stuff, your VO2 max development at a younger age. And, you know, all this can really influence how good of a runner you get when you're older. Like if you get 2 random friends and one of them has no sporting background and the other has a bit of sporting background but hasn't done sports for a few years, you might notice that even if they start at the same level, the guy that has the sporting background will probably improve a little bit quicker than the guy that hasn't had any sporting background. Obviously, there's a lot of other factors involved, genetics and how well you respond in general, which again is genetics, to training. But a lot of the times you will see this very interesting pattern. People who were sporty when they were young they're going to improve a bit quicker. So that might play into a factor on how much speed training you do versus how much of an aerobic focus you have. It is important to remember though, with distance running, 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon, it is very, very, very aerobic. It's like 90-something% aerobic for most of it. Marathons are 99-point-something% aerobic. So the speed is literally the icing on the cake. And when you've exhausted everything else, that's when speed might be good to kind of pull from the top to make sure that you still create more room for improvement for threshold and all that, which I've talked about in other videos. But that's why sporting background is important. The guy that has the sporting background could probably get away with doing literally something like 5x100 every week or even once every 2 weeks and just focus more on getting in the volume. But someone that's new with no sporting background might have to develop more of their biomechanics, how to run quick, because that's a skill in itself. Running with good form doesn't just come naturally to everyone. You have to kind of create the neuromuscular connection, get used to the technique of running itself, and also recruiting the right muscle fibers in the most efficient way. Like, all that takes a little bit of time, and those people might need to focus a bit more on the speed while still trying to improve their base as well, obviously, because that's a huge part of the marathon. But yeah, these two people might be training very, very different ways, especially if they're getting coached by someone that knows their stuff. They're not going to be doing the same cookie cutter training. So that's why you need to take into account, what background do you come from? Do you have the speed already, or do you need to have more of an aerobic focus? What is your threshold like in relation to your VO2 max? Like, all these are things to consider before programming how you're going to train. And moving on to periodization, it's important to know that you shouldn't be doing the same weekly structure for the entire year. It's nice to have periods of time where you have a focus more on speed, another period where you have a focus more on aerobic development, so more threshold, LT1 stuff kind of thing. Yeah, you need to really, really think about having a little bit of that variety and not doing the same thing the whole year. If you do the same thing the whole year, you have a very high chance of hitting a plateau pretty early on. You need to have ebbs and flows and a seasonal arc in order to progress every season. Eventually you will exhaust the amount of gains that you can get with the same training. So if you do the same thing, you're going to remain the same. And if you add a bit of variety, if you add a bit of periodization, you're going to improve year on year. So all these pro runners are talking all the time about base phase, sharpening phase, racing season. And now moving on to more specifics that you can, apply to your training in itself. Even when you're training for like a marathon or something, it's not always the case of do your base training, do your threshold, then do your speed work. Like, it really depends, and obviously can intermingle everything in between as well. The main thing I wanted to make clear was that depending on what your strengths are and weaknesses are, you might even tackle speed first. Because using me for an example, my threshold is pretty close to my VO2 max right now, and I need to pull that ceiling up in order to create a bit more space for my threshold to improve. So if I were to hit a marathon block right now, the first thing I would do is increase my VO2 max to have a bit more leeway of improvement for threshold. I feel like I've already kind of hit close to the ceiling with my threshold just because my VO2 max isn't that high right now. So I really need to develop a bit of that VO2 max in top end speed in order to, get a bit more out of my training and actually improve a little bit more. So I would tackle speed first, but someone else might want to, just sharpen the speed at the end because they already have pretty good speed and they need to improve their threshold at the start. So if you want to know more specifics about when to do VO2 max blocks and stuff like that, I did make a whole video on that, so I'm not going to go into as much detail in this one, but I think I went into enough detail that it gives you a bit of thought on like what to do from there. And with threshold is something you can do the whole year. Again, I made a whole video on this and there's way more videos on threshold coming soon. If you have any questions about threshold specifically, comment them below, but I do have a lot of videos on it already. Threshold is something that's sustainable. You're gonna finish the workout and still feel like you have a little bit of energy left in you, like you're not fully cooked at the end. So it's something that is sustainable year round. You might do different volumes of threshold throughout the year. So you might be doing like 10Ks worth of threshold in a certain part of the season, whereas in another part of the season you might be only doing 6Ks worth of threshold in a single session. So that might change, but threshold is something you can do the whole year. So now that we talked about having VO2 max sessions placed in like 6 to 8 week blocks and stuff like that, again, watch my VO2 max video, and then doing threshold year round, we can now think about all the other runs in the week. So that's like recovery runs, long runs, easy runs, and also light speed or top end speed, which a lot of people get confused with VO2 max. But starting off with top end speed, because that's probably the most confusing.
I think a lot of people forget how to sprint, and I had as well. And I think developing this speed with this huge base I was building was like a perfect combo for me. Another sample session, like actually yesterday was my first light speed session back. I guess with the new training block, I did 100, 200, 100, 200, 100 off lap jog. And yeah, I was hitting them pretty hard. Like I was, running 14 low, 27 flat, I ran for a rep, 13 low. I even dipped on the 13, which is, impressive for me. I haven't got much natural speed, so this is definitely something I put a lot of emphasis on. Yeah, especially if you do decide to do a bit more of like a threshold model, you're not touching that anaerobic side quite enough, that you kind of need to, implement some of these more high intensity anaerobic work. Like this is pure sprint. This is pure, ATP, PC system kind of work. If we're talking real, science in energy system wise. So definitely one of my favorite workouts of the week, and definitely something I would try. It's worked really well for a lot of athletes I've kind of given it to, especially youngsters. I think it's really important just to make sure we're sprinting, like we're still getting that recruitment of all those fast twitch muscle fibers.
Top end speed is working on raw mechanical speed, whereas VO2 max is more oxygen consumption based. So we need to still have that real top end speed to supplement all the threshold training and VO2 max training that you're doing, because we always want to be maintaining that raw mechanical speed. And I feel like a lot of people forget about that, including myself. So I'm trying to do more stuff like this. And this isn't something that we need to do in high volumes, literally something like 5x100, really, really hard effort. That's kind of what you want to do. And that's enough to actually maintain being sharp for a long time. Again, you can't stay sharp the whole year round, so it's not something you need to do the whole year, but at the same time, it's not a lot of volume, so it's not hard to do for a long period of time. And you can use more of that proper VO2 max block to try and peak at the right time and stuff like that. And again, it depends on so many factors, which is why it's hard to make videos like this, because it's so contextual, situational. And again, I do coaching, private coaching, so let me know in the link in the description via the waitlist if you want to get coached, and I'll reach out to you, if I'm available for coaching. And right now, I'm looking for a few more athletes, so I think it'll be pretty cool to coach some of you guys watching this video. So moving on, we're going to talk about easy runs and recovery runs. So obviously, easy runs, we're trying to increase our mitochondrial density, we're trying to improve our cardiac output via stroke volume and decreased heart rate, and more heart muscle contractility, more capillarization, so blood vessels around the muscles to deliver oxygen a little better. All these little things that's going to improve with a lot of easy running, so that's why we do it. The difference between easy running and recovery running is recovery runs are basically the slowest pace that you can possibly run without feeling like you're forcing yourself to run slow. So, for example, it depends on the day, but let's say 6:30 per kilometer, I can run autopilot all day without even thinking about it. It's my automatic pace. But 6:45 per kilometer is where I have to force myself to run slower, and if anything, it feels harder than running 6:30 pace, which doesn't make sense because it's slower, but everyone has that different sort of threshold where if you run any slower than that, it feels really forced. So you're trying to run the slowest possible without feeling like you're forcing yourself to slow down. And the purpose of this recovery run is to increase blood flow, get the oxygen to your muscles, and also remove the waste products so that you can recover a bit quicker without adding the mechanical load of the pounding of the pavement. So we're running as slow as possible to minimize pounding on the pavement and extra unnecessary stress, but we want to increase the blood flow and facilitate recovery. So we call that active recovery. And obviously long runs are for being able to run for a long period of time without fatigue, getting your legs, muscles, tendons, bones, ligaments used to the pounding on the pavement for a long amount of time, staying on your feet for a long amount of time, building that resilience, even mental resilience. Long runs, lots of benefits. Obviously your lactate's gonna increase over time as well, especially if you do workouts in the second half of the long run. You're definitely gonna be working at that sweet spot for a long time. There's a lot of benefits to be gained from long runs. There's different types of long runs. I made a whole video on that, check that out. But that's also a crucial part of the training structure. But in most scenarios, you only need to do that once a week. You can do another medium run in the middle of the week if you want, but again, it's very contextual, situational, so really hard to say. But I guess that's the main thing for the other runs of the week. But the final thing I will touch on this topic is that every single type of run is giving you different types of benefits, but in different ratios. Like for example, with LT1, yes, you're getting more mitochondrial benefit and capillarization and aerobic development, all that sort of stuff. You are still getting a little bit of lactate buffering benefit as well. And same with LT2. Yes, we're working closer to our threshold between sustainable and red line, but we're still getting that aerobic development, even though the main purpose is for lactate buffering. So try and think of it as, if you're hitting a variety of different paces, you're getting benefits from a little bit of everything, but certain intensities give you a little more of a certain type of adaptation compared to another intensity. Obviously, when you're running insanely fast speeds, you are still getting the aerobic benefit from it, but way less than just doing proper aerobic runs, right? So it's not like one or the other. You don't suddenly flip off a switch just because you're running higher intensity, or just because you're running lower intensity. It doesn't mean you're not getting any running technique benefits. You're still getting running technique benefits from a slower pace, but just not as much as doing quality high intensity intervals, right? So that's kind of how I think of it, which is why I always talk about how variety is important in training, so they get the benefits of everything over time. So now we're going to talk about rest and recovery. And this is a huge part of training, as you all know, because you only benefit from training that you recover from. And if you don't recover well, you can't train more. And if you can't train more, you can't race optimally. So we want to be able to recover well so that everything else kind of comes together well with your training. So recovery is like half the training. You need to be able to be good at that. Especially with my athletes, I'm always keeping an eye out on who seems to be really good at recovering and who doesn't seem to be, because the athletes that can recover more, I do end up getting them to a higher mileage, and obviously the result of that is better performance as well. So recovery is definitely an important factor. And yeah, it's going to vary a bit depending on, you know, again, your lifestyle. Like some lifestyles are just not made for optimum recovery. If you have an irregular sleep schedule, you're inevitably not going to be recovering as well as a pro runner who their full-time job is to run and recover, basically. So yeah, that's why we need to really keep in mind what is the optimum amount of rest days, and how can we play around with the runs to have periods of time where we get a bit more rest and periods of time with less rest. So there's a lot of directions we can take this, but the first thing I'll probably say is that if you're running 6 or 7 times a week, you don't need to fixate on 7-day week, 7-day week, 7-day week. Some people actually do a 6-day week followed by a 7-day week, followed by a 6-day week, followed by a 7-day week, meaning every fortnight they get a rest day, which is really interesting because everyone thinks of it as like, you know, 1 rest day a week or 2 rest days a week, but they never think of it as 1 rest day per fortnight. And the benefit of doing a 6-day week is that you're getting more aerobic benefit because your runs are going to be longer to achieve the same mileage as a 7-day week, right? If you have 7 days of running in a week, you can spread out the mileage across more days, and therefore your runs might be a little bit shorter than if you're only running 6 days and doing the same mileage. So there's benefits to both, and that's why I like having both, because that's really good for runners to be able to experiment with both. And another thing I want to talk about is the concept of false rest days. I kind of thought of this myself, like I haven't really gotten this from anyone else, but if you think about it, when you run in the morning and the next time you run is the afternoon of the next day, you have 36 hours in between the 2 runs. Because if you run in the morning and you wait 24 hours, that's the next morning, but you're running in the afternoon of the next day, so that's literally a day and a half. So even if you run on Monday and Tuesday, if you run Monday morning and Tuesday afternoon, you literally have a rest day still. And that's a way to implement a rest day without actually having a rest day, if that makes sense. So once you get better at recovering and you recover quicker, you can start playing around with false rest days, and then you start running for an entire calendar year without taking rest days, or not that much. You still do have periods of like 36 hours every week where you do recover, right? So I think that's something important to consider. Like I probably had less than 10 rest days this year, but I've had plenty of periods where I have 36 hours of rest in between 2 runs. So I think that's been working really well for me this year. Knock on wood, there's not really any wood around here, but obviously you don't really want to do back-to-back like hard session followed by a long run. Like you do kind of want to separate those days in between, especially if you're only running 4 days a week or 5 days a week. It's really easy to spread the harder days apart. So threshold, rest day, or easy day, VO2 max, easy or rest day again, long run. It's easy to spread them apart. So try and do that as much as you can where you can. But once you get to stuff like double threshold, the purpose is that we want to recover as much as we can on other days. So we're trying to cram harder days kind of together so that other days we can recover. So stuff like afternoon threshold session followed by the next morning do another threshold session so that you can recover on either end of that a bit better. That's really important to consider as well. I do a lot of that sort of double threshold, PM, AM double threshold. But obviously the traditional double threshold is doing morning and evening double threshold, and the days before and after that you kind of take a bit more easy. So again, very individual, but stuff to think about for sure. I think another thing to consider is I always feel better when I run the day before a long run or the day before a workout or a threshold workout. So I try and make sure I never go from a rest day straight into a workout. I find that that's a big jump in intensity, like doing nothing on the couch to like doing a high intensity session. So that's why I kind of like running every day, but some days are super easy and then the next day might be a harder session. So at the end of the day, I know I did blabber a lot, but I know that a lot of this can be really applicable to everyone's training. And the reason why I wasn't really specific with any of my tips is because, again, I'm not coaching anyone watching the video right now. And I want to make sure I give everyone the framework, how my mind works, so that you guys can incorporate it well to your training. Again, I made plenty of other videos on how to train and stuff like that, threshold focus, VO2 max focus, and many different things. So go watch those videos. I have a whole playlist in the description where you can just see every single running tip video that I've ever made. And yeah, again, if you want coaching, hit me up in the link in the description. You have to fill out a waitlist form and you have to give me a bit more detail on like your sporting background and what you're training for and what your longest long running training is, that sort of stuff. If you give me a good amount of info, I'll probably be able to get a good idea of where you're at and whether I can get you to your goals. So keen to coach some people, so let me know. And as always, I have a buy me a coffee link in the description. That's your easy way to support the channel. I'm actually going to unpaid placements for 5 weeks, where again, I'm doing full-time hours for 0 pay, which actually really hurts because I can't do YouTube as much because of that as well. So yeah, any support is appreciated, even like $5. That's probably gonna add up to, being able to support my meals and stuff during the placements. But obviously, only donate if you have the capacity to do so. But otherwise, thank you for watching. Leave a like, comment below. Please spread this channel and videos to a lot of people because that does help as well. Obviously, I earn a bit of money from YouTube from the ad revenue. So yeah, it means a lot when the channel grows a lot. So thank you so much and I'll see you in the next video.